Welcome to Puget Sound History and another installment of History in Color. At the end of this film, I will present the photos as they were before coloring. As always, thank you for spending your time with us. In this video, we will be talking about Purdy, Washington. As I begin to make this film, I realized it will have to be a somewhat brief overview of the beginning and some of the buildings that remain. I am sure that in the future I will revisit the town of Purdy for another video. Purdy, Washington is a small community located on the shores of the Burley Lagoon and Henderson Bay. Henderson Bay had been used for generations by the Native Americans for its great fishing and clamming. The tribe was the Suquamish. The Suquamish numbered 441 people in 1857. Their territory was from Kingston to Gig Harbor on the west side of the Puget Sound. In 1855, their chief Sealth, the city of Seattle's namesake, along with others would sign the Treaty of Point Elliott, and they would give up their land and move to the reservation at Point Madison on Bainbridge Island. With the United States government now in control of the region, they sold the land to settlers and businessmen alike. The federal government's program, the Homestead Act of 1862, was a good option for those who were unable or didn't want to pay for land. This program required residence and improvement for 5 years plus a registration fee. The land could also be purchased from the government after 6 months for $1.25 per acre. Isaac Hawke was one of these homesteaders. In the early 1860s, he came to log Henderson Bay. He homesteaded the area now known as Purdy from the Washington Territorial Government. Canadian-born Thomas Fuller had done some gold mining at Sutter's Mill in California somewhere between 1848 and 1855, then went to Michigan to land himself in the census for 1870. By 1883, he was in Purdy. He was a farmer/laborer. In 1884, Isaac Hawke sold 19 acres of land for the price of $23.75 per acre to Horace Knapp. Horace, a Civil War veteran as part of the 57th Pennsylvania Volunteers, had participated in the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862. General Robert E. Lee and General George B. McClellan, with a combined total of 142,000 men, fought it out in Maryland. It was the bloodiest day in American history, with 22,717 dead, wounded, or missing. Of those, Mr. Knapp was one and would carry a bullet in his leg for the rest of his life. So, leaving the war behind, he set out for the West. By at least 1870, he was in Washington Territory. Josephine Fuller Cowley, daughter of Thomas Fuller, recently widowed, along with her older brother Thomas Theodore, came from Michigan to Washington to visit their father in 1884. They would be stuck in Tacoma at a hotel for a couple weeks, as no one knew where Henderson Bay was, and their only recourse was to write their father a letter letting him know they were in Tacoma and wait for him to come to town. He got the letter, and he picked them up, and they got in a rowboat and rowed all night to get to Purdy. Thomas Fuller had a little cabin on the beach at Henderson Bay. When Josephine arrived, she was the first non-native woman on all of Henderson Bay. Josephine stayed for a short time with her father and hunted deer and dug clams before eventually returning to Tacoma, where she lived for a time. William Rowland, Joseph Purdy, Newman Klein, and James Ashton had fished and hunted the Henderson Bay area for years. In the early 1880s, they would talk of making the area a town site, and more importantly, a mill town. But we'll have more on this later. Brown's Wharf and Navigation Company put the steamer Bob Irving on a weekly route between Tacoma, Quartermaster Harbor on Vashon Island, and Gig Harbor. They also made a stop at Henderson Bay and anywhere in between. In 1884, Captain Brown's sternwheeler sold groceries and other supplies. When the boat was due to show up, it was an event for the whole family. With a scow bow and a long overhang, the Bob Irving could run aground on any beach and run its gangplank out for the customers. That was very helpful in the days before docks were built everywhere. The boat was due once a week and would dump freight and mail right on the beach. They had a small shed that the items could be stored in until the owners picked them up. 1885 was a busy year for Horace Knapp. He sold the land that is now Purdy to James Ashton. He also married Josephine Fuller. She came to live with him in a little house near the end of the present bridge. The next year, she gave birth to a son, Earl Horace Knapp. In 1889, she once more gave birth to a son, Seth. In the same year Ashton bought the land from Horace, he platted a town site. Ashton's enthusiasm for the future town was so great that Tacoma's mayor called him the mayor of Purdy. Ashton replied, "Never mind, you fellows will all be pulling for Purdy before you die." James Ashton, Joseph Purdy, William Rowland, and Mr. Sherman wasted no time setting to work, and in 1885 they built a lumber mill on a small inlet of Burley Lagoon just down the hill from present-day Peninsula High School. There was a log chute along present-day 144th Street that brought the logs down the hill to the water. Horace Knapp greased skids for the oxen to pull logs over when there was a huge log that needed to be pulled over and the oxen didn't want to do it. Horace was the only one who could coax them into doing it. It was in 1886 that the mill in the town got its big break. It got a contract from the Navy. The Navy was opening a new ship repair facility in Bremerton, which would open in 1891, Puget Sound Naval Yard. The Navy wanted boards with a bevel on one side, like clapboard siding. They used 2 saws to complete this bevel, which allowed them to save time and have a lower bid and win the contract. The lumber was needed for a dry dock they were building, soon to be known as Dry Dock 1. There is another account that says the mill was opened around 1888, which would make more sense as to the building and opening of PSNS. Purdy soon became known as a brawling mill town. The mill's success also brought conveniences to the area, like a grocery store, post office. The post office was on a lumber camp log raft from 1886 to 1895, after which the function transferred to Springfield, which is present-day Wana. Horace Knapp left Seattle to try to strike it rich in the Nome, Alaska gold rush somewhere during the years 1899 and 1909. Joseph W. Purdy, a grocer in Tacoma, offered to supply the construction materials for the school in exchange for the town site being named after him. Mr. Purdy and his business partner, W.G. Rowland, owned a store in Tacoma. Having customers on Henderson Bay, it was a good decision for him. Horace Knapp deeded the land the school would be built on at the bottom of the hill from the current high school, right near the beach. Horace and Josephine's son attended the little school, which housed all grades under one roof. In 1900, a new school was built, also on land given by the Knapps. The new school was on Sherman Avenue, now 68th Avenue. The old building was then used as the Purdy Women's Club. Students spent every other semester at either the Purdy Schoolhouse or the Wana Schoolhouse to keep both schools active. The second schoolhouse stood until 2015 when it was demolished. The current elementary was built in 1970 and opened its doors in 1971. In 1900, the first oyster factory opened. It was called the Tyee Oyster Company. and from what I uncovered, it was owned by Harry Wetherell, but may have been bought by Pete Olliott, as the owner's nickname was the Frenchman. Articles of incorporation were filed in 1932. Tyee was worth $26,000. In 1939, it seems to have been owned by Harry Allen. Harry won the second place in a local rooster race that year and was an avid rooster trainer. Jerry Yamashita bought the oyster farm from him in 1952. Jerry had been working in oyster beds since he was 13. His father was an oyster buyer and broker who came to Seattle in 1900. World War II began, and the Yamashita family was sent to Toole Lake Internment Camp in California. In 1945, they were released, and by 1947, Jerry had returned to the Puget Sound to DeBob Bay near Quilcene to plant his oyster beds. He named it the Western Oyster Company. The oyster seeds he planted came from Japan because the native Olympia oyster had been picked to near extinction, as well as the size and speed of growth of the Japanese oyster was superior. At this time, he partnered with another oyster grower named Dick Steele. Together they formed Pacific Oyster Growers Association, which still exists today. One of their first acts would be to officially name the Japanese oyster the Pacific Oyster. In 1958, a joint venture of the Washington State Department of Health and the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare created a shellfish sanitation research laboratory. They operated out of old U.S. Army buildings that were brought from Vashon Island to Purdy. At the time, the biologists there were considered doctors of the shellfish. They were checking levels of fecal matter in the shellfish and looking for any signs of sickness in the oysters. They were still there in 1964. As of the making of this film, I do not know when they disbanded or if they even did. Of course, not everyone was happy with the oyster business. The community club sent a letter to Mr. Yamashita in 1968 or 69. I will quote, "Because we are concerned about the aesthetic environment of the area in which we live, we would like you to remove the unsightly bundles of rusty wire dumped at the water's edge in the Burley Lagoon. We also object to the dumping of oyster shells on the shores of Burley Lagoon. Also, we are aware that you have applied for and received permission from the Army Corps of Engineers to build a dock at Burley Lagoon. No public notice of such a request has been made to our knowledge. We would again protest such construction as we have in the past." In 1982, Jerry told the Tacoma News-Tribune that he doubted oysters would make a comeback to Henderson Bay, but by 1998, the pollution that had troubled Western Oyster Company had cleared up, and it was back to business as usual. Everything was going as planned until 2006, when the buildings were hit by fire, and the loss was calculated to be $80,000. Mr. Yamashita sold the rights to farm the tidelands to Taylor Shellfish Farm in 2012. Earl Knapp married Lily Forsberg in 1916 and went on to have 10 children. The Knapps were often called upon to ferry people across the channel, dividing their property and the split. In 1892, the county authorized a drawbridge. This was a wooden structure supported by timber piles with a swing span at the channel. The center span swung on a pivot to permit tugs to pick up log rafts at the Wilson Logging Company in the Burley Lagoon. At about the time the first bridge was built, settlers borrowed fill from the hillside at the Wana end of the spit to make it an all-weather route. Before that, the spit flooded when the high tides and winter storms coincided. They set posts to hold driftwood and brush, and the occasional shipwreck to stop erosion. Earl worked as a rigger to help build the Purdy Bridge. Once completed, arriving tugs would whistle and someone, usually one of the Knapps, would come and open the bridge. The second bridge was built in 1905, but strong tidal currents washed away some of the pilings and it collapsed. The county replaced it using day labor. In 1919 and 1920, the county again built the bridge, and this time it had a steel swing span. Barged in from Puyallup, nearby property owners initiated a lawsuit against it. They did not like how it looked. These experiences and troubles influenced the form of the present Purdy Spit Bridge. This has been part 1 in a 2-part series about the town of Purdy. Thank you for bearing with the audio troubles that I've had during this video. I hope to get a different microphone soon. If you have any stories or information regarding any of these topics, please feel free to comment in the comment section. And if you want to see more of these videos about local history of Western Washington, subscribe to my channel. Until next time.